Why was the woman in seat 13F sitting so perfectly still? The Boeing 757 sliced through clouds at 35,000 feet, carrying 127 souls who had no idea that one of them didn't belong here. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thornton pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching Kansas farmland scroll beneath her like a patchwork quilt stitched by God himself. Wheat fields, irrigation circles, perfect geometry hiding ordinary lives she would never know. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't wearing the uniform. The denim jeans felt wrong, foreign, like borrowed skin after endless months in flight suits that smelled of jet fuel and sweat and purpose. The navy sweater her sister Diana had given her last Christmas, the one that had hung untouched in her closet while she commanded the 455th Fighter Squadron through Afghanistan's killing heat, felt almost luxurious now. Soft wool instead of tactical gear. Comfort instead of Kevlar. But her body hadn't forgotten. She sat ramrod straight, unconsciously maintaining posture drilled into her 2 decades ago at the academy. Hands resting precisely on armrests, feet flat on the floor, alert even in rest. Old habits don't die, they just wait. Her commanding officer, General Patricia Hayes, had practically ordered her to take this leave. "Thornton," the general had said, leaning back with that knowing smile, "you've been running on caffeine and sheer determination for 2 years straight. Your squadron is home safe. Your mission reports are filed. If I see you in my office before May 1st, I'm personally having the MPs escort you to the nearest beach." So here she was. Just another passenger on United Flight 847 from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. Just Rebecca Thornton, not Colonel Thornton, not Firebird, not the woman whose tactical innovations had saved forward operating base Chapman from being overrun. Just a tired officer visiting her aging mother in Arlington, Virginia. Anonymous, unremarkable, exactly as she'd hoped to be. First time flying commercial in a while. Rebecca turned to find the flight attendant, a woman about her age with kind brown eyes and graying temples pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag read Angela Foster, and her smile held the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent years managing anxious travelers. "Something like that," Rebecca replied with a small smile. Angela refilled Rebecca's coffee with the precision of someone who'd mastered pouring at altitude. The rich aroma mixed with recycled cabin air, creating that unique atmosphere of commercial aviation. Part anticipation, part resignation, entirely familiar to anyone who'd spent their life in the sky. But Angela lingered. Her experienced eye caught details most passengers would miss. Rebecca's perfect posture, the way her eyes automatically tracked to the nearest emergency exits, the unconscious precision with which she'd stowed her carry-on, everything squared away and secure. There was something about the way this passenger held herself, a bearing that spoke of discipline and command. "Military?" Angela asked quietly, her voice carrying the respect of someone who understood the weight of service. Rebecca hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the coffee cup. She'd hoped to blend in, to disappear into the anonymous crowd of travelers, to be just another face among the 127 souls aboard this aircraft. But something in her demeanor had given her away. Perhaps the way she'd automatically cataloged emergency procedures during the safety demonstration, or the instinctive way she'd assessed the flight crew during boarding. "Air Force," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the steady drone of the engines. Angela's expression softened with immediate understanding. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "My husband was Navy, 22 years, 3 deployments to the Gulf, retired last year as a senior chief." Her eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd lived through the unique challenges of military life, the deployments, the missed holidays, the constant worry. "I can always tell, it's something in the way you carry yourselves." She paused, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Thank you for your service, ma'am. Whatever you did over there, wherever there was for you, thank you." As Angela moved on to other passengers, Rebecca settled back into her seat, feeling both exposed and oddly comforted. Around her, the ordinary drama of civilian air travel unfolded in all its mundane complexity. The rhythms of normal life she'd almost forgotten existed. In seat 13D, directly beside her, a businessman in his 40s pecked furiously at his laptop keyboard, his Bluetooth headset blinking as he conducted what sounded like a heated conference call about quarterly projections and market penetration. His world of spreadsheets and profit margins seemed impossibly distant from the life Rebecca had been living. Across the narrow aisle, a young mother named Nicole Davis struggled valiantly to keep her twin toddlers entertained. The boys, perhaps 3 years old, were fascinated by everything: window shades, tray tables, overhead bins. Their father dozed fitfully beside them, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, exhaustion written across his features. A military ID card peeked from his wallet in the seatback pocket. Army from the look of it. Probably just returned from deployment himself, Rebecca guessed, recognizing that particular bone-deep weariness that came from months of hypervigilance finally giving way to the safety of home. Behind her, a group of college students shared earbuds and laughed over something on their phones. Spring break, most likely, heading home or to some beach destination. Their biggest worry was probably their next exam or whether they'd remembered to set their DVRs. Their voices carried the easy confidence of youth, the assumption that the world was fundamentally safe and predictable. None of them knew. None of them knew that the quiet woman in the window seat had earned the call sign Firebird after coaxing her battle-damaged F-16 home through enemy fire over the Hindu Kush. None of them knew she'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions that saved the lives of 200 Marines at a remote outpost, or that her face graced a recruitment poster in the Pentagon's earring corridor. To them, she was simply another passenger, maybe a teacher heading home for the weekend, or a businesswoman on her way to a conference, anonymous and unremarkable, exactly as she'd hoped to be. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to remember what normal felt like. When had she last sat somewhere without automatically identifying potential threats and escape routes? When had she last heard laughter that wasn't tinged with the gallows humor of combat? When had she last been surrounded by people whose biggest worry was a delayed connection rather than incoming mortar rounds? The steady vibration of the aircraft's twin engines created soothing white noise, and for the first time in months, Rebecca felt her shoulders beginning to relax. Outside her window, the American heartland continued to scroll by. Small towns connected by ribbons of highway, rivers meandering toward distant seas. The geometric precision of agricultural planning stretching toward horizons that held no threat of enemy fire. This was what she'd been fighting for. Not the abstract concepts of freedom and democracy that filled speeches, but this mundane miracle of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The businessman worrying about sales figures, the young mother managing her children's restless energy, the students planning weekend adventures, the beautiful, complex tapestry of normal life that could only exist when warriors like her stood guard at the borders of chaos. But something was wrong. She felt it before she heard it, a subtle change in the engine's rhythm, a vibration that didn't belong. Her eyes snapped open, her body instantly alert, every nerve ending firing signals her conscious mind was still processing. The businessman beside her continued his conference call, oblivious. The toddlers across the aisle giggled at their tablets. The college students kept scrolling through their phones. They didn't feel it. But Rebecca did. 20 years of flying had made her intimately familiar with the language aircraft speak, the subtle vocabulary of vibrations and sounds that tell you when something isn't right. And right now, this Boeing 757 was trying to tell her something. The vibration intensified, still subtle, still something most passengers wouldn't notice. But Rebecca's hand tightened on her armrest, her body tensing with recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. Then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Brian Mitchell. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with one of our engines. Nothing to be concerned about, but as a precaution, we'll be diverting to Denver International Airport. We should have you on the ground in approximately 45 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin. Minor technical issue. The words hung in the air like a lie everyone wanted to believe. Rebecca heard what he didn't say, heard it in the careful control of his voice, the precise calibration of reassurance. She'd used that same tone countless times when speaking to ground crews while nursing a damaged aircraft home, projecting calm while internally running through emergency procedures. This wasn't minor. Around her, passengers reacted with varying degrees of concern. The businessman sighed with annoyance, already calculating how this would affect his schedule. The college students groaned about missed connections. The young mother pulled her boys closer, her expression tight with worry, but they were still calm, still trusting, still believing that everything would be fine because that's what the captain had told them. Rebecca unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood smoothly, her movements controlled and purposeful, and made her way toward the front of the cabin. Angela Foster was there, speaking quietly with another flight attendant, their professional masks firmly in place, but Rebecca could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat," Angela said gently, but Rebecca caught her arm. "I'm Air Force," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. 20 years, fighter pilot. I need to speak with your captain, now." What could a passenger possibly know that the pilots didn't? Angela Foster's professional composure wavered for just a moment. She'd been flying for 17 years, had handled countless emergencies, had been trained to manage panic and maintain order in crisis. But something in this woman's eyes, something in the steel-quiet certainty of her voice, made Angela hesitate. This wasn't some nervous passenger wanting reassurance. This was something else entirely. "Ma'am, I can't just—" "Angela," Rebecca's voice dropped lower, more urgent. "That vibration we're feeling, it's not minor. I've flown combat missions in damaged aircraft. I know what critical systems failure feels like, and we don't have 45 minutes. You need to get me to that cockpit before this situation becomes catastrophic." The second flight attendant, a younger woman whose name tag read Sarah Chen, had gone pale. "How bad?" "Bad enough that your captain is lying to keep people calm," Rebecca said bluntly. "Which is the right call, but I can help. I've brought aircraft home with worse damage than this. Let me help." Angela made a decision. She'd learned to trust her instincts over nearly 2 decades of flying, and right now, every instinct she had was screaming that this military woman knew exactly what she was talking about. She knocked on the cockpit door in the specific pattern that signaled crew communication, then leaned close to the intercom. "Captain, we have a situation. Military passenger requesting access. Says it's urgent." There was a pause, a long one. Rebecca could almost hear the debate happening on the other side of that reinforced door. Post 9/11 protocols were clear. The cockpit was a fortress. Nobody got in except authorized crew. But these were also pilots facing an emergency, and in emergencies, you take help where you can find it. The lock clicked. The door opened, and Rebecca found herself looking at Captain Brian Mitchell, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of weathered calm that came from thousands of hours in the left seat. His first officer, Denise Park, was younger, perhaps 40, her hands steady on the controls but her jaw tight with concentration. "You've got 30 seconds to tell me why I should let a passenger into my cockpit during an emergency," Mitchell said, his voice professional but strained. "Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thornton, United States Air Force, serial number deleted for security," Rebecca said crisply. 20 years, 1,500 combat hours, current on multi-engine aircraft. Call sign Firebird. You can verify my credentials later, but right now, Captain, you've got a number 2 engine that's about 30 seconds from complete failure, and when it does, the vibration is going to cascade into your hydraulic systems." Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. How could you possibly? Because I've felt this exact failure sequence before, Rebecca interrupted. December 2019, F-16 over Kandahar. Different aircraft, same physics. That vibration pattern you're experiencing. It's not the engine itself. It's the mounting brackets failing. They're sending harmonic resonance through your airframe, and when they finally give way, you're going to lose more than just thrust. First Officer Park turned in her seat. The gauges are showing normal engine function. Your gauges are lying, Rebecca said flatly. Or rather, they're showing you what's happening inside the engine, but not what's happening to the engine. The mounting failure is external to your sensor array. You won't see it until it's too late. As if on cue, the aircraft shuddered violently. Not the subtle vibration from before, but a teeth-rattling shake that sent coffee cups flying and drew gasps from the cabin behind them. Alarms began screaming in the cockpit, red lights flashing across the panel. Jesus Christ, Mitchell breathed, his hands flying across controls. Number 2 engine failure, Park called out, her training kicking in. Complete loss of thrust, hydraulic pressure dropping in systems A and B. Told you, Rebecca said quietly. Now, gentleman lady, do you want my help or not? Mitchell didn't hesitate. He gestured to the jump seat behind his position. Strap in, Colonel. Tell me what you need. Rebecca slid into the seat with practiced efficiency, her eyes already scanning the instrument panel, cataloging information with the speed of someone who'd spent 2 decades reading life-or-death data in combat conditions. The Boeing 757 was shaking like a car on a washboard road, the asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine trying to pull them into a spiral. Mitchell fought the controls, his knuckles white, while Park worked through emergency checklists with mechanical precision. Altitude, Rebecca asked. 32,000 feet, Park replied. Denver's 100 miles out. You're not going to make Denver, Rebecca said bluntly. Not with these hydraulics failing. You need an alternate plan. What's closer? Mitchell's jaw clenched. Colorado Springs Municipal is 60 miles southeast. Shorter runway, but it's something. How short? 7,200 feet. Rebecca did the math instantly. A 757 with this much damage, landing hot because they couldn't dump fuel fast enough, braking systems potentially compromised. That's going to be tight, really tight. You have a better idea? Mitchell asked, fighting another violent shudder as something else failed. Actually, yes. Rebecca leaned forward, her finger tracing a path on the navigation display. Peterson Air Force Base. Military installation, 18 miles from Denver. They've got a 13,000-foot runway designed for heavy cargo aircraft and a full emergency response team already on standby because they monitor commercial aviation in their airspace. Park looked up from her checklist. Can we even get clearance to land at a military base? You're about to have an Air Force lieutenant colonel in your cockpit requesting emergency military assistance, Rebecca said with a slight smile. I guarantee they'll clear you. Plus, they have the equipment and personnel to handle this kind of damage. Fire suppression, crash crews, medical evac. Everything Denver has plus military-grade emergency response. Mitchell made his decision. First Officer Park, get me Peterson Tower. Tell them we're declaring an emergency and requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. Tell them, he paused, glancing at Rebecca, tell them we have Firebird aboard. Rebecca's eyebrows rose. You know that call sign? Colonel, every military pilot knows that call sign, Mitchell said. You're a legend. Now help me keep this bird in the air long enough to get us on the ground. For the next 20 minutes, the cockpit of United Flight 847 became a symphony of controlled chaos. Rebecca worked in tandem with Mitchell and Park, her combat experience translating seamlessly into commercial aviation crisis management. When the primary hydraulic system failed completely, she guided them through a gravity extension backup that she'd used once over hostile territory. When the electrical system began fritzing from the engine's violent separation, She reconfigured power distribution using techniques she'd learned from a grizzled maintenance chief in Bagram. "You're losing control surface response," Rebecca noted, watching Mitchell struggle with increasingly sluggish aileron response. "The hydraulic failure is propagating. You need to start using differential thrust on the remaining engine for directional control." "That's going to burn fuel like crazy," Park warned. "Fuel's not our limiting factor anymore," Rebecca said quietly. "Structural integrity is. Every minute we stay in the air, that engine mounting continues to tear itself apart. We hit the ground in the next 15 minutes, or we don't hit the ground at all." The weight of those words settled over the cockpit like a shroud. Mitchell glanced back at her, and in his eyes, Rebecca saw the same look she'd seen in young pilots' faces before their first combat mission. Fear, determination, trust. "Okay, Firebird," he said softly. "Talk me through this. What do I need to know?" "First," Rebecca said, "you need to tell your passengers the truth." "How do you tell 127 people that they might die?" Captain Brian Mitchell's hand hovered over the intercom switch. Behind him, Rebecca Thornton sat perfectly still in the jump seat, her eyes reflecting something he recognized because he'd felt it himself countless times. The weight of responsibility. The knowledge that words matter, that tone matters, that in moments like this, how you speak can mean the difference between order and chaos. "They need to know," Rebecca said quietly. "Not the technical details, not the worst-case scenarios, but they need to know this is serious. They need time to prepare themselves mentally, to make their peace if it comes to that. They deserve that dignity." Mitchell nodded slowly. He'd been flying for 32 years, had landed with blown tires, electrical failures, hydraulic problems, but he'd never faced anything quite like this, had never felt an aircraft coming apart beneath him in quite this way. He took a breath, centered himself, and pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell." His voice carried through the cabin, cutting through the nervous chatter and forced laughter that had filled the past 20 minutes. 127 people stopped what they were doing and listened. "I need to be honest with you about our situation. We've experienced a catastrophic failure of our #2 engine, and it's caused damage to several of our flight control systems. We're currently diverting to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, where emergency crews are standing by. I'm going to ask our flight attendants to begin preparing you for an emergency landing. This means reviewing your safety cards, identifying your nearest exits, and assuming the brace position when instructed." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I want you to know that we have an exceptional crew working this problem, including a United States Air Force combat pilot who's volunteered to assist us. We're doing everything possible to bring this aircraft down safely, but I need you to take this seriously. Follow the crew's instructions exactly. Stay calm, help your neighbors, and trust that we're going to do our absolute best for you." The silence that followed was profound. No panic, no screaming, just the kind of heavy, crystalline clarity that comes when people suddenly understand that this is real, that the unthinkable might actually happen. In the cabin, Angela Foster was already moving with practiced efficiency, her voice carrying calm authority as she demonstrated the brace position. Sarah Chen worked the aft galley, helping passengers secure loose items and ensuring everyone understood the emergency procedures. The businessman in 13D had closed his laptop, his conference call forgotten, his expensive watch now just a piece of metal on his wrist. The young mother held her twins close, whispering reassurances while her husband gripped her hand with white-knuckled intensity. And in seat 13C, an 8-year-old boy named Christopher Hayes looked at his mother with wide eyes and asked the question that children ask when the world suddenly makes no sense. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His mother, Emily Hayes, pulled him close and whispered the only thing she could. "We're going to try our very, very best." Back in the cockpit, Rebecca was running through contingencies with Mitchell and Park, her mind working through scenarios with the cold precision of someone who'd made life-or-death calculations in combat. When we get within 10 miles of Peterson, you're going to start feeling the aircraft trying to roll right, she explained. The asymmetric drag from the damaged engine is going to increase as we slow down for approach. You'll need to counter it with left aileron, but your hydraulics are compromised, so the response is going to be sluggish. How sluggish? Park asked. Sluggish enough that you'll feel like you're fighting the plane instead of flying it, Rebecca said honestly. I won't lie to you. This is going to take everything you've got, both of you, and it still might not be enough. Encouraging, Mitchell muttered, but there was no bitterness in his voice, just grim acceptance. I'm not here to lie to you, Captain, Rebecca said. I'm here to get you home, and that means being honest about what we're facing. Peterson Tower came through the radio, the controller's voice tight with controlled urgency. United 847 Peterson Tower, we have you on radar. Emergency equipment is in position. We're clearing all traffic from the pattern. Runway 35 left is yours. Winds are 320 at 15, gusting to 25. How do you want to approach this? Rebecca leaned forward. Tell them we'll need a long, straightened approach. No fancy maneuvering. We don't have the control authority for precision flying anymore. We're going to point this bird at the runway and ride it down. Mitchell relayed the information, and Peterson acknowledged. Through the cockpit windows, the Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks beautiful and terrible against the afternoon sky. Beautiful because they represented home, safety, the end of this nightmare. Terrible because if this landing went wrong, those mountains would be the last thing 127 people ever saw. 5 miles out, Park called. Speed 210 knots, descending through 8,000 feet. Rebecca watched the instruments with laser focus. The aircraft was wallowing now, responding to control inputs with the grudging reluctance of something fatally wounded. Mitchell was doing incredible work, somehow keeping them on a reasonable glide path despite systems that were failing in real time. But she could see the strain in his shoulders, feel the aircraft fighting him with every input. Start your roll left, she instructed. Counter that asymmetric drag before it builds up too much. Smooth inputs, don't try to muscle it. Mitchell eased the yoke left, and the 757 grudgingly complied. It's like flying through molasses, he grunted. You're doing great, Rebecca said, and meant it. Just keep that mental picture of the runway in your head. Everything we do from here is about getting to that threshold. 2 miles, Park announced, gear down. The landing gear extended with a series of heavy clunks that reverberated through the airframe. Rebecca held her breath, waiting to see if the gear would lock properly with the compromised hydraulics. 3 green lights illuminated on the panel. Gear down and locked, Park confirmed, relief evident in her voice. Small victories, Rebecca murmured. The runway appeared in the distance, a long strip of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from this altitude. Peterson's emergency vehicles lined both sides, their red and yellow lights flashing in silent testimony to the seriousness of what was about to happen. Rebecca could see fire trucks, ambulances, crash crews in their silver suits standing ready to run toward disaster if disaster came. 1 mile, Park called, speed 180 knots. Flaps to landing position, Mitchell ordered. The flaps extended, changing the aircraft's aerodynamics and inducing a sudden roll to the right that Mitchell barely caught in time. Rebecca's hands clenched on her armrest, but she kept her voice calm. Steady. You've got it. Just ride it down. 500 feet, Park announced. Through the windscreen, the runway grew larger, rushing up to meet them with terrible speed. Rebecca could see individual markings on the concrete now, could see the emergency crews tensing in anticipation. Could see, in her peripheral vision, Mitchell's hands making constant tiny corrections, fighting the aircraft every inch of the way down. 300 feet. The ground rushed up. 200. Mitchell's jaw was clenched so tight Rebecca thought his teeth might crack. 150. And then, with a jarring impact that rattled every rivet in the airframe, United Flight 847's wheels touched concrete. The aircraft bounced once, hard, then settled with a screech of rubber that echoed across the tarmac. Mitchell immediately deployed the thrust reversers on the remaining engine, and Rebecca felt the aircraft start to slow, felt the brakes grab, felt 13,000 feet of runway stretching out before them like a lifeline. But they were going too fast. The runway numbers ticked by with terrifying speed. 3,000 feet remaining. 2,000. The aircraft shuddered as Mitchell applied maximum braking, but the compromised systems weren't responding at full capacity. 1,000 feet. "We're not going to stop in time," Park said, her voice finally cracking. Rebecca leaned forward, her mind racing through options. Then she saw it. The emergency turnoff at the runway's end designed for exactly this kind of situation. "There," she said, pointing. "That turnoff, take it." "That's a 90-degree turn," Mitchell protested, "at this speed." "It's that or the grass," Rebecca said flatly. "And in the grass with this damage we'll cartwheel, take the turn." Mitchell made his choice. At the last possible second, he cranked the wheel hard left, steering the crippled 757 into the turnoff with the kind of aggressive precision that would have made any flight instructor scream in horror. The aircraft tilted sickeningly, the right wingtip missing the ground by what looked like inches. Tires screamed in protest. Metal groaned. And then finally, blessedly, they stopped. United Flight 847 sat silent on the Peterson Air Force Base taxiway, surrounded by emergency vehicles that had raced to intercept them. Inside the cabin, 127 people sat frozen for one heartbeat, two heartbeats, three. And then someone started crying. And then someone else started laughing. And then the entire cabin erupted in a sound that was part sob, part cheer, part prayer of thanksgiving. In the cockpit, Captain Brian Mitchell's hands were shaking as he reached for the radio. "Peterson Tower, United 847 is on the ground. We're okay. Everyone's okay." "Copy that, 847, the controller responded, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Welcome home." Rebecca unbuckled her harness with hands that were steadier than she felt. She looked at Mitchell and Park, both of whom were staring at their instruments as if unable to believe what had just happened. "You two," she said quietly, "are two of the finest pilots I've ever flown with." Mitchell turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Colonel Thornton," he said, his voice rough, "you just saved 127 lives." "No," Rebecca said gently, "we did, all three of us. This was a crew effort from beginning to end." What happens when a ghost becomes real? The emergency slides deployed with their characteristic whoosh, and passengers began evacuating down the inflatable chutes with varying degrees of grace and terror. Angela Foster stood at the forward door, her professional composure finally cracking as tears streamed down her face, helping each passenger to safety while repeating the same words over and over. "You're safe. You're safe now. You're okay." Rebecca waited until the last passenger had evacuated before following Mitchell and Park out of the cockpit. They emerged into a cabin that was empty except for the flight attendants doing their final sweep, and the silence was deafening after the chaos of the emergency landing. She could see where coffee had spilled during the violent shaking, could see abandoned phones and tablets and books left behind in the rush to evacuate, could see the imprint of lives that had been, for 30 terrifying minutes, balanced on a knife's edge between continuation and ending. She descended the slide with practiced efficiency, her feet hitting the tarmac just as a squadron of emergency responders surrounded the aircraft. Paramedics were already triaging passengers, though remarkably, incredibly, there appeared to be no serious injuries. Some bruises from the rough landing, some cuts from luggage that had shifted, but nothing catastrophic. Nothing that required the body bags the crash crews had quietly prepared. Colonel Thornton. Rebecca turned to find a man in an Air Force flight suit approaching, his rank insignia marking him as a major. He was younger than her, perhaps mid-30s, with the kind of lean intensity that marked fighter pilots everywhere. His name tag read Patterson. "That's me," she said. "Ma'am, I'm Major Tyler Patterson. I was in one of the F-22s that escorted you in." He paused, his expression shifting to something like awe. "We monitored your approach on our radios. What you three did in that cockpit. Ma'am, that was the most extraordinary piece of flying I've ever witnessed." "The captains did the flying," Rebecca said automatically. "I just provided some technical consultation." "Technical consultation," Patterson repeated with a slight smile. "Is that what they're calling miracles these days?" He gestured toward the aircraft, where investigators were already beginning their examination. "We've been tracking that engine failure since it started. Our analysis showed you had maybe a 5% chance of landing that aircraft successfully. And somehow, you did it with no fatalities, no critical injuries, and an intact airframe." Rebecca looked back at the damaged 757, seeing it properly for the first time since they'd landed. The number 2 engine was completely gone, torn from its mounting in a way that left jagged metal and exposed hydraulic lines. The wings showed stress fractures where the vibrations had propagated through the structure. The fuselage bore scorch marks from overheated systems. They should have crashed. By every reasonable calculation, by every statistical model, they should have scattered themselves across the Colorado landscape in a debris field that would take weeks to map. But they hadn't, because 2 commercial pilots had refused to give up, and because an Air Force colonel on mandatory leave had been sitting in seat 13F. "Colonel Thornton." The voice carried across the tarmac with the kind of authority that made people instinctively stand straighter. Rebecca turned to find a woman in Air Force dress blues approaching, stars on her shoulders glinting in the afternoon sun. A brigadier general, flanked by 2 junior officers taking notes. "General," Rebecca said, coming to attention. "At ease, Colonel." The general extended her hand. "Brigadier General Sarah Vance, commander of the 21st Space Wing. I heard Firebird was on that plane and helped talk it down. I had to come see for myself if the legend was true." "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, ma'am," Rebecca said. "Funny how that keeps happening to you," Vance said with a knowing smile. "First Afghanistan, now this. You have a talent for being where you're needed most." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "I've already spoken with your commanding officer, General Hayes. She's aware of the situation and sends her compliments. She also said, and I quote, 'Tell Thornton this doesn't count as a vacation, and I still expect her to stay away until May 1st. Despite everything, Rebecca laughed. It felt good to laugh. Felt like a release of tension that had been building in her chest since the first moment she'd felt that wrong vibration in the engines. Around them, the scene was organized chaos. Passengers were being loaded onto buses to take them to the terminal for processing. Emergency crews were securing the aircraft. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing footage that would dominate the evening broadcasts. And through it all, Rebecca became aware of something strange happening. People were staring at her. Not with the casual curiosity of passengers looking at their fellow travelers, but with something else. Recognition, respect, the kind of looks usually reserved for people who have done something extraordinary. Major Patterson was speaking quietly with his wingman, a female captain whose flight suit bore the call sign Ghost. They kept glancing over at Rebecca with expressions that bordered on reverence. "Ma'am," Captain Ghost approached hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, I went through flight training reading about what you did in Afghanistan. The way you brought that damaged F-16 home. You're kind of the reason I wanted to fly fighters in the first place." Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest. She'd never thought about her actions in those terms, had never considered that somewhere, somehow, A young woman might have looked at her story and seen possibility instead of impossibility. "What's your name, Captain?" she asked gently. "Allison Crawford, ma'am, but everyone calls me Ghost." "Why Ghost?" Crawford smiled slightly. "Because they said someone like me would never make it through fighter training. Said I was too small, too quiet, too female. So I decided to become a ghost in the machine, invisible until it was time to strike." Rebecca saw herself in this young pilot's eyes, saw the same determination she'd carried through the academy, through flight school, through every mission where she'd had to prove herself twice as capable just to be considered half as good. Saw the same quiet strength that didn't announce itself but simply existed, undeniable and unbreakable. "Keep flying, Ghost," Rebecca said. "The Air Force needs pilots like you." The crowd of military personnel was growing now. Word had spread across Peterson that Firebird herself was on the tarmac, that the legend who'd saved Fob Chapman was the same person who just talked down a crippled commercial airliner. Active duty officers, retired veterans, Air National Guard members, even military spouses and children who worked on the base, all gathering to catch a glimpse of someone who represented something larger than themselves. Angela Foster appeared through the crowd, her eyes red from crying but her smile genuine. "Colonel, there are some people who'd like to thank you personally." Rebecca followed her to find the passengers from Flight 847 gathering in small groups, comparing their experiences, showing each other the photos they'd managed to take during the evacuation. The businessman from 13D, Preston Wallace, stepped forward first. His expensive suit was rumpled now, his tie askew, but his handshake was firm. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. I have 2 daughters waiting for me in D.C. Because of you, I get to see them again." The young mother, Nicole Davis, approached with her twins clinging to her legs. "My boys kept asking if the pilot lady was going to save us. I told them yes. I don't know how I knew, but I did." One by one they came. The college students, suddenly serious and thoughtful. The father who'd been dozing, now fully awake and grateful. An elderly couple who'd been traveling to visit their grandchildren. A soldier heading home on leave. Each one carrying their own story, their own moment of terror, their own relief at being alive. And then 8-year-old Christopher Hayes broke through the crowd and stood before Rebecca with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Ma'am, are you really a fighter pilot?" Rebecca knelt down to meet his eyes, her expression softening into the warmth that her squadron members had always seen, but the public rarely witnessed. "I am, Christopher. And today I got to help Captain Mitchell and First Officer Park fly your airplane home safely." "My dad says fighter pilots are the bravest people in the world," Christopher continued with 8-year-old logic. "Are you brave?" Rebecca considered the question seriously, the way she would any technical inquiry about aviation or tactics. "I think brave people are just regular people who do what needs to be done when others are counting on them. Today, everyone on that airplane was brave. Your mom, the other passengers, the flight crew, we all worked together." "Will you sign my boarding pass?" Christopher asked, producing the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I'd be honored," Rebecca replied, taking out her pen and writing carefully. To Christopher, "Remember that heroes are ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Aim high. Colonel Rebecca Firebird Thornton, USAF." As she handed the boarding pass back to the boy, Rebecca noticed that other passengers were approaching with their own requests. Nicole Davis wanted her to meet her children, who were fascinated by the idea that a real pilot lady had saved their flight. Preston Wallace simply wanted to shake her hand again and thank her. The college students asked for a group photo that they promised to treasure forever. But what struck Rebecca most profoundly wasn't the recognition from her military colleagues, though that meant more to her than she could express. It was the impact on the civilian passengers who had shared her unexpected journey from seat 13F to the cockpit of a crippled airliner. These weren't people thanking some distant authority figure. They were thanking someone who'd been sitting among them, anonymous and unremarkable until the moment she was needed. They were thanking someone who could have stayed in her seat, someone who could have let the professionals handle it, someone who could have played it safe, but didn't. When does a moment become a memory that defines everything that comes after? The sun was setting over Peterson Air Force Base, painting the Colorado sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost impossibly beautiful after the day's terror. Rebecca stood on the tarmac, watching as the last of the passengers boarded buses to take them to hotels where United would put them up for the night. Tomorrow, they'd continue their journeys on different aircraft. Tonight, they were just grateful to be alive. Captain Brian Mitchell and First Officer Denise Park approached, still wearing their uniforms but looking somehow different. Younger, perhaps, or maybe older. It was hard to tell what surviving something like that did to a person's face. Mitchell extended his hand, and when Rebecca took it, he held on for a moment longer than a simple handshake required. "Colonel Thornton," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today. You didn't have to step into that cockpit. You could have stayed in your seat and hoped for the best like everyone else. But you didn't. You put yourself in the middle of it and helped us bring everyone home safe." "Brian, you and Denise did the flying," Rebecca said firmly. "I just provided some technical consultation. This was a team effort from beginning to end." First Officer Park shook her head with a slight smile. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that was the most extraordinary display of airmanship I've ever witnessed. You took a situation that should have been catastrophic and made it look almost routine." Before Rebecca could respond, Angela Foster appeared with tears visible in her eyes. "Colonel Thornton, there are some people outside who would like to see you." Rebecca followed Angela through the terminal and out to the main entrance, where she stopped short at the scene before her. On the tarmac below, she found herself facing a formation of military personnel that seemed to have materialized from every corner of Colorado's aviation community. Active duty officers, retired veterans, Air National Guard members, even military spouses and children, all standing in respectful formation. At the front of the group stood Major Tyler Patterson, still wearing his flight suit from the F-22 escort mission. His wingman, Captain Jessica "Ghost" Crawford, stood beside him. Behind them, Rebecca recognized faces from across her career. Former squadron mates, pilots she had trained, ground crew members who had serviced her aircraft during countless deployments. "Colonel Thornton," Major Patterson called out, his voice carrying across the tarmac with military precision. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and the aviation community, we request permission to render honors." Rebecca felt a moment of overwhelming emotion as she realized what was happening. These weren't just military personnel paying respects to a superior officer. These were warriors honoring one of their own, recognizing not just her actions on this day, but the lifetime of service that had led to this moment. "Permission granted," she replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence in her heart. Major Patterson snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. His wingman followed immediately. Then, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, every military member present came to attention and saluted. Active duty, retired officers, enlisted, representing every branch of service, but united in their respect for the woman who had just reminded the world what it meant to answer the call when duty demanded everything. The moment stretched across the tarmac in profound silence, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines and the click of news cameras capturing an image that would grace front pages across the nation. Rebecca Thornton, still wearing the civilian clothes she had put on that morning for a simple flight home, stood perfectly erect and returned the salute with the same precision she had learned as a cadet 26 years earlier. Behind the military formation, civilian observers had gathered as well. Airport workers, airline employees, passengers from other flights who had been delayed by the emergency, all watching with the kind of reverence usually reserved for state funerals or medal ceremonies. Some were crying, Others held up phones to record a moment they understood was historic. As the salute concluded, individual members of the formation began to step forward. Master Sergeant Lawrence Fitzgerald, who had served under Rebecca during 2 deployment rotations, was the first to approach. "Colonel, it's an honor to see you again, ma'am. You haven't changed, still making the impossible look easy." Behind him came others, each carrying their own piece of the Firebird legend. Chief Master Sergeant Daniel Wright, who had been the senior enlisted member in her squadron during the Afghanistan deployment that had made her famous. "Fire," he said simply, using her call sign with the familiarity of someone who had watched her launch into hostile skis night after night. "You brought us all home then, and you brought them home today. Some things never change." Rebecca felt something breaking inside her chest. Not breaking like damage, but breaking like a dam that had been holding back 2 decades of emotion she'd never allowed herself to feel. Pride, grief, connection. The overwhelming recognition that she wasn't alone, had never been alone, that she was part of something larger than herself. A lineage of warriors stretching back through history. A community of people who understood what it meant to serve. A family bound not by blood but by shared sacrifice and the unspoken promise that when one of them needed help, the others would come running. General Vance stepped forward last, her expression solemn. "Colonel Thornton, I've been authorized to inform you that the Air Force is recommending you for the Airman's Medal for your actions today. Additionally, the FAA and commercial aviation community will be recognizing your contribution to flight safety." She paused. "But I think you already know that the real reward is standing right here. These people, this moment. The knowledge that 127 souls are alive tonight, because you were exactly who you are." Rebecca looked out at the gathered crowd, military and civilian, strangers who had become family in the crucible of crisis, and she realized that General Hayes had been wrong about one thing. This hadn't been a vacation from her service. This had been her service distilled to its purest form. Not the medals or the call signs or the recruitment posters. Just one person choosing to help when help was needed. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the tarmac. "But I need you all to understand something. What happened today wasn't special. It wasn't extraordinary. It's what any of us would have done in that situation. It's what we're trained to do, what we're built to do. We serve, not for recognition, not for glory, but because when the moment comes when people need us, we step forward." She paused, looking directly at Captain Crawford, at the young pilots gathered in the formation, at the next generation who would carry this tradition forward. "That's all I did today. I stepped forward, and I'll keep stepping forward for as long as I'm able, because that's what we do, that's who we are." The crowd erupted in applause, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was too busy watching Christopher Hayes, still clutching his signed boarding pass, looking up at his mother with eyes full of wonder and possibility. Too busy seeing Nicole Davis hugging her twins close, whispering promises about tomorrow. Too busy noticing Preston Wallace on his phone, voice thick with emotion as he told his daughters he was coming home. Lives continuing. Stories unfolding. Ordinary miracles made possible by ordinary people who chose, in one critical moment, to be extraordinary. 6 months later, Rebecca would stand before graduating cadets at the Air Force Academy and tell them that service isn't something you put on with your uniform, that it's a choice you make every day, in every moment, regardless of what you're wearing or where you're sitting. That sometimes the most important missions happen in civilian clothes on commercial flights when you're just trying to go home. But standing on the tarmac at Peterson Air Force Base, surrounded by the faces of people whose lives had been changed by 3 hours in a damaged aircraft, she was still learning that lesson herself, still understanding that Firebird wasn't just a call sign earned in combat over the Hindu Kush. It was a way of being. A commitment to rising when others needed you, to burning bright when darkness threatened, to refusing to let fear or doubt extinguish the light of purpose. The legend of Firebird had grown that day. But more importantly, 127 people had been reminded that in moments of crisis, ordinary Americans, whether wearing the uniform of their country or the casual clothes of a weekend traveler, will step forward to serve something greater than themselves. Angela Foster approached one last time, her professional composure restored but her eyes still bright with emotion. "Colonel, your mother called. She heard what happened and wanted to make sure you're okay. I told her you'd call when you were ready." Rebecca smiled. Her mother, who had watched her daughter choose this life 26 years ago and had spent every day since carrying the quiet terror of loving someone who flew toward danger instead of away from it, who deserved to hear her daughter's voice and know that today, once again, she was coming home. "Thank you, Angela," Rebecca said, "for everything, for seeing who I was, for trusting me to help, for being exactly the kind of professional that makes this whole system work." Angela pulled her into a hug that violated every regulation about professional boundaries between crew and passengers. "No, ma'am. Thank you for reminding us all why we do this job, why any of us do any job. Because sometimes, on the worst day, the person sitting in seat 13F turns out to be exactly who we need." As the crowd began to disperse and the emergency crews finished securing the damaged aircraft, Rebecca Thornton stood alone for a moment on the Peterson tarmac, watching the sun complete its descent behind the Rockies. Tomorrow, she'd resume her mandated leave, would visit her mother in Arlington, would try, once again, to remember what normal felt like. But tonight, she carried with her a truth that felt both ancient and newly forged. A truth that had been whispered in the cockpits of damaged aircraft over hostile territory and in the silent moments before impact on a Colorado runway. That service isn't measured in rank or medals or years of time. It's measured in moments, in choices, in the decision to stand when sitting would be easier, to speak when silence would be safer, to step forward when stepping back would be justified. Sometimes, dignity doesn't announce itself with fanfare or demand recognition for its sacrifices. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that action, in that quiet choice to be who you are when the world needs you most, lies the truest form of heroism. Not the kind that makes headlines or earns parades, but the kind that saves lives, changes trajectories, reminds ordinary people that they are capable of extraordinary things when the moment demands their best. Rebecca Thornton, call sign Firebird, had spent 26 years learning that lesson. Today, in seat 13F of United Flight 847, she had lived it once more. And somewhere above her, in the darkening Colorado sky where she had spent so much of her life, the stars were beginning to emerge. Each one a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, even when the engines fail and the systems cascade and the odds stand against you, there is always light. You just have to choose to be it.